whoa, we're finally taking off. And so now podcast listenership is really, really growing. And also the numbers of people who are producing podcasts, that has been growing steadily. But now there seems to be this renewed interest in podcasting, which we're very excited about at Rabble. It took us a long time to catch up to video on the internet, but I think that we're finally making some ground, and people are recognizing that you don't always have to have pictures. So having said that, then, we are growing. What is changing in the podcast environment now is, it was about, a couple of years after, like, the big broadcasters like National Public Radio and CBC, and it's like they kind of dipped their toes into podcasting in the early days, but it's only getting to the point now where people not just in the public radio sector, but also producers who have made a living in the public radio sector are now getting into the game, and they're starting to look at how to make money. I mean, one of the podcasts that's very successful, seems to be successful financially as well, is the Canada Land podcast. And he's actually making a living at it. And what's happened now, which has shifted the landscape around that, is there's a whole new standard of, okay, we use this word professionalism, which is one of the words in this title. And it's sort of like public radio values have become more a part of podcasting than they were in the early days. In the early days of podcasting, it was like a community radio station where we didn't, it's like at a community radio station, the technical standards weren't always perfect. The production standards weren't always perfect. It's like it was individuals who were doing shows because they love it. And, yeah, I will admit, both in community radio and also on the Rabble Podcast Network, there are places where I wish our quality is better. And by quality, I don't mean the topics that people are developing, but it's like the technical, abilities of a lot of people are not what I would always like to hear on the podcast network. And how to structure and put together a show so that it is really, easier for audiences to listen to. Like, for example, in the early days of podcasting, then podcasts were sometimes referred to as ramblecasts because people would often just open up the microphone and just talk. And it's like that was one of the wonderful things about podcasting, is you couldn't just do that on the radio because, except for community radio, nobody would ever put you on the air. Community radio is still caught in that sort of, are we like part of the radio industry with all of those conventions that come along with being radio? And so it's sort of like I felt sometimes in community radio that it's like maybe we were a little bit hamstrung by the way it's done in radio. So, but yet at the same time, it's like in those early days, sometimes there wasn't even any editing. And so I remember there's one podcast I listened to, which wasn't on the network, but anyway, I loved it. It was two guys who moved from England and decided to buy a farm in Nova Scotia. It was a charming podcast. It was raw as anything. I liked it because it was sincere as anything too. But there were times when they go, whoops, there's somebody at the door. I'm going to go, and so there'll be a gap of 3 minutes there while he goes to answer the door. It's like, that's what editing is for, folks. So, simple, things like that. And there's still podcasters who, they could be making the quality of their podcast better from a technical point of view. When I use the word professionalism, when I've gone to community conferences before, or community radio conferences before, and the term professional has been raised, there's often been a really big sense of resistance in the room where people are equating professionalism with doing it like they do it at CBC and commercial radio. What I'm saying, I don't even like the term professional. I like the term, instead of, how can we make our programs as professional sounding as possible, how can we craft them so that they're the best programs that we can make? So whether you're... Yes, make them better than professional. Or, and so how do we then make programs that are, that really, really sparkle for our listeners as well? And so that's what I'm talking about if I use the word professional, which I don't like to use. But what I encountered both in community radio and with Rabble as well is it's a little bit awkward sometimes because you have people who are volunteering their time. And it's like, I feel like there are some programs that we have on the podcast network, like we had at stations that I was on staff for, where it's like, I really, really wish we could do something about that. But first of all, there's not often the time to do the training that we need. I think training is key, and people don't learn. It's like people have to learn how to do this, and there have to be opportunities. And at a community radio station, there's never enough time for training. With my role in the podcast network, there's never enough time for training either. And also, too, I feel quite awkward if a person is giving of their time. I'm not going to treat them like they're an employee, and there is a trend in community television these days, like the Rogers model, where they're treating volunteers in some cases like they're unpaid staff. And it's like, my volunteers and people who produce these shows are not unpaid staff. They are program producers who are doing it the way that they want to do it. But so how do I then, if I hear something that goes, ooh, the levels are a little off, or, your intro, it takes a long time to get into the show. Maybe there are other ways that you can work with the interview so that you don't have to talk for 4 minutes before you get into the interview. And so things that, my background is also not just community radio, but I also spent 13 or 14 years at CBC Radio in a number of capacities as well. And there are just things where that wouldn't happen on CBC Radio, because if it's that quality, it's not going on the air, regardless of how good the subject is. It's like there's a minimum technical standard that must be met. So I don't want to impose those standards, but I do want to bring up the level. And what I've often thought, it's funny, when I first started doing community media, and my brother-in-law, who was a commercial TV producer, then I said I was working with volunteers, teaching them how to do media. And he said, well, yeah, but aren't you just going to get a bunch of bad media done then? I said, well, okay, I don't know where to begin with that statement. But anyway, I said, well, what we, whoops, I think I'm losing the mic here. Okay. So what I said to him was, well, then why don't we work to improve, to provide training opportunities so the standard can get better? And it's like, he says, well, if they're not going to be able to do it well enough to make a living at it, what's the point? And I said, look, we don't tell people who want to play hockey that you shouldn't play hockey unless you're going to be NHL caliber. But this is the hangover from media as industry. We're now in the phase where media is like more of a vocation. It doesn't matter if you're making a living at it. We have the tools now that everybody can do it. And that is really, really different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So my question is how to work with volunteers and to bring up the overall standard and still make them feel like the program is their own and not having me act as an employer. And so my approach, anyway, tends to be more like I send out these little sort of information blurts on our listserv that goes to all of our podcasters and say, did you know there's a such thing as, do you ever wonder you're listening and first of all, the voice will be really loud and then it'll be really soft? So technical tips about how to work with that so that the voice is even. I say, here is something you can do. And so I send out tips. Every now and again, I mean, there are times when I really, really would like to get very involved in the show and saying, let's overhaul this. Except I, A, do not have the time, and B, it's very, very delicate to approach a volunteer and say, I've got one show, for example, that is a community radio show from Australia. And what they do is they just take their show from Australia and they just put on the rabble introduction, and then they say goodbye at the end. And it's a radio show from Australia, complete with time checks and weather checks and everything like that. I would love to rework that show with them, but A, I don't have time in my part-time hours, and B, are we going to lose that show if they have to reversion it for us? So it's Groundwire is a situation too where it's a radio show which goes on radio stations, and they have their own conventions in radio that they need to work with. And so if we're repurposing it, how much repurposing can happen, and how do we do it in a way that works with the volunteers' schedules and what they want? So anyway, I think I'm pretty much coming to the end of my time here, and Gretchen can tell you about Groundwire. But just to summarize and say, it's a very delicate dance when wanting the best quality possible and also respecting the integrity and the abilities and also the independence of our podcasters who don't need to do it for us. The same thing with community radio. Volunteers don't have to do shows. So how do we work with them diplomatically in a way that they feel like they're being honored and the content improves? So that's me for now. Over to you, Gretchen. That's a radio segue. The time is.
So, as we talk about radio, let's listen to radio.
Welcome to Groundwire Community Radio News, brought to you by volunteers at Canada's community radio stations.
This episode of Groundwire was produced on Mississauga's The New Credit Territory in Toronto by Ome Selma Rahimtullah, and we're your hosts. I'm Carly Forbes.
And I'm Jael Chung from CILU in Thunder Bay. Winnipeg's Kurdish community rallies on World Kobani Day.
So, just in the first few seconds of hearing Groundwire, do you notice anything different from other national news programs that you've heard broadcast in Canada? There was a land acknowledgement at the top. There was an acknowledgement that this episode was produced on Indigenous land, and the name of that Indigenous nation was mentioned out of respect not only to the people whose land we're on, but also out of acknowledgement that there is an ongoing colonization process that, as media makers, we have to acknowledge that there's an underrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the media landscape. They shouldn't just be on APTN. They need to be on headlines every day in Canada, especially in light of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that's just one way that Groundwire is trying to redefine what is mass media. And the reason I'm interested in Groundwire is because I have a background in trying to create platforms that are not just a 1-watt pirate radio transmitter, but platforms that can ultimately replace the mass media. So how can we link up all the pirate radio broadcasters? For example, this was work that I did in the States whenever low-power FM radio was illegal, linking up pirate radio broadcasters using the internet to distribute audio and then creating, essentially, a mass media system of unlicensed broadcasters sharing content. So that background, that experience of mine goes back to 1999. When I came to Canada, I was already part of the movement to create independent media centers where people were converging to produce collectively audio, radio, video, doing it in collaborative ways, but also trying to disseminate that on platforms like the internet. And so through those experiences, I really valued trying to maximize the reach of the content that we produce that's so different than what's available in the rest of the media. Fast forward to 2004 in the National Campus and Community Radio Association Conference in Edmonton, I attended what we called a community news convergence. And in this convergence, we just had a conversation among people who were really invested in community news in Canada. And the number one thing on everybody's mind was, we need a Democracy Now! In Canada. A lot of our stations air Democracy Now! We don't have a counterpart. We don't have something like that here in Canada, and they're so U.S.-centric. We love their focus, but their interests, but their focus is so U.S. So the mandate then at that time was to try to create a community news program for Canada, covering social movements and issues with a different point of view than offered in the other media, different political opinions, following different types of political actors, like Democracy Now! Does in the U.S. Media landscape, but obviously rooted here in Canada and representing our diverse communities across Canada. Somebody, I think, Emily, you talked about the Montrealization of Francophone news in Canada. There was also the Torontoization of English news in Canada. And so Groundwire wanted to break through all of those barriers and represent the diverse regions. And so we decided to create a collaborative model of sharing a common community radio news program. So we collaborate in production, we share it clear across the country. Different communities that are hosting highlight their issues when they're hosting, but also can pitch to any show as well. So you can see on this episode the different contributions that came in. And I wanted to show you just a couple slides that I prepared to talk more about how we organize this practice of ultimately trying to create community radio news as mass media in Canada. Is Alex here, by the way? Alex? Check, Alex? No? Okay, just checking. So I won't stress about the time, but I know we have a lunch break at 12:30. Very conscious of that, and we want to hear your comments. So this is Groundwire's mandate. We're basically a 29-minute news radio program. When we had the idea in 2004 to do this, we went through pretty much a 4-year development process that was a little bit too long to launch an episode, our first monthly episode in 2008. We stayed monthly for a year, and then we upped our production to twice a month. And we share that, as I mentioned, across stations to build local capacity. So the idea is if CHUO hosts Groundwire, which hopefully we'll do in a future time, it's an opportunity to bring together volunteers in your station who may or may not have news interests, just to take on that initiative for that moment, produce that 30 minutes, and then be completely thrilled at the fact that their production is going to air on 30 stations. It's a really great way to galvanize interest in collective production, but also interest in news. And so that's how we build in capacity building in the Groundwire process, is the fact that we rotate the production. So one of the ways that facilitates contributions to Groundwire is a clear priority bureau. The mass media have, the other mass medias have clear agendas. We actually declare our biases as community media producers, that we have these priorities. This is the kind of news that we want to serve up. And if you pitch us a headline and it's related to Indigenous communities in Canada, to student movements in Canada, to labor issues in Canada, all of those other issues that you see there, you will most likely be guaranteed to be syndicated on Groundwire with your piece. That doesn't mean that, you know, we're biased. Like I said, all media are biased. They have their priorities. They all follow, you know, the news cycle that we've heard criticized so much. This is a way of declaring our own biases and also breaking through that news cycle and representing issues that are underrepresented or marginalized in the media. And also bringing the communities who are directly affected by these issues to speak to them. So I wanted to show you Groundwire's editorial policy that makes that happen. So if you're curious how to contribute, this is how you contribute. So here, this is where I feel Groundwire makes a really important contribution in redefining how to approach some of the common issues that journalists face. How do we approach balance? It's there. Groundwire is a counterweight. It's not an alternative. It's more than that. How do we approach diversity? We have it written out in our policy. This is what we're looking for. Can you read that? Is it a bit small? Okay, hold on just a second. I realize I'm right by the screen. I can't read it either. Now it's bigger. Okay? Context, I think, is really important. Most stations, most news outlets do not provide context to the news that they carry. Groundwire is actually mandated to provide context, and that can be challenging, but we do it. And one of the best examples I heard was a producer acknowledging that the community that was doing a land claim and had set up a blockade of a highway had heritage claims to that area for more than 3,000 years. That's something that is rarely acknowledged in the other media, that an Indigenous community in Canada might have a claim to that land for 3,000 years older than Canada. Like, that just doesn't happen because it breaks the Canadian myth, right? It challenges Canadian national identity. But some context does that, and we have to include it. And it can be a challenge because sometimes there's a lot of context you want to include. But I think in trying to challenge what is a headline, addressing context is one way to break through that challenge of reducing everything down to who, what, when. Well, why is also important as well. And so context allows us to do that. Obviously, participatory. I want to mention that Groundwire is not just participatory in its production practices, but also in its governance practices and in its training practices. So annually, you were talking about, trying to do training and how do you give feedback. Every year at the National Campus Community Radio Conference, we have a Groundwire training track where we actually collectively, in person, collaborate in the production of an episode of Groundwire. And it is a fabulous community radio moment when you're able to achieve something together that you struggled so hard on all week and met pressing deadlines and at the last minute had to run out and go get that other interview and all that stuff. All of that gloriously culminating in a production of Groundwire that will air on 30 stations across the country. So we do that every year. And that really helps build the capacity because the annual conference of the campus community radio stations generally brings together around 100 people. And of that, you might have a crew of a dozen. But then that's a dozen people who are newly interested in Groundwire and have the skills to pull it off and the interest to keep working. So that's something we found very valuable. We also have a steering committee where members who have been part of the Groundwire production process sit and provide editorial advice. They can provide production assistance if needed. They can provide content suggestions if needed. We don't meet that regularly as a governing body, but we meet as required. We also have an in-person meeting at the annual conference that's open for anybody to come. And we've actually had people join that meeting and join Groundwire in that meeting for the first time. So people just show up, I never heard about Groundwire, what's this? Oh wow, you have really open governance processes. I'm helping you edit your editorial policy. That's amazing, I'd like to be on your committee. That happened, and that's great when that happens because we should be open and participatory in the structures of our media institutions. And for community radio, which mandates participatory programming production, why not also have a mandate to create participatory governance structures as well? Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit more and just show you a couple other things. I think another one of the ways in which Groundwire is redefining journalism in Canada is our approach to language. We prioritize Indigenous language content. Not many other national news broadcasters prioritize Indigenous language content. Even APTN is failing to broadcast in Indigenous languages. In terms of French and English, we don't treat those as solitudes. We have them at times in the same program. Sure, there'll be voiceover, but also a goal is to have people with different accents, whether it's a francophone reading in English and hosting in English, or someone else with a different kind of accent, but just to put different accents on air. And that's really important because we've all been indoctrinated into the way and the style of presentation of the CBC. And I say we all, presuming you all listen to CBC, but I do think that there have been standards, and I know that there have been standards set in news media broadcasting where it has to follow a certain tone, a certain rhythm, pronunciation has to happen in a certain way. In the United States, they talk about a Midwest accent. In Canada, they talk about a prairie accent. And if you don't have those accents, you won't be on the national news. Well, Groundwire takes the opposite approach. We want those accents. We want to represent the linguistic diversity of Canada. We want to represent that there's different ways and value, that there's different ways of hearing the news. And we even produced in 2009 a news data analysis to compare approaches on CBC and approaches on Groundwire. And that was a valuable teaching tool because a lot of people come into community radio and Groundwire thinking this will get me into CTV or this will get me into CBC. And it's really interesting when you put the comparison together, not just in terms of the language issue, but also in terms of the kind of content that you tune into and who is speaking to that content. And so just to give one example from that data analysis, because I think we compared something like 6 or 7 programs on same topics that matched Groundwire's priority bureaus. So we looked at the coverage of the 5-year anniversary in Haiti. We looked at the 20th anniversary of the defense of Ganastage. And we looked at who had the mic. We also looked at the G20 meeting in Toronto, for example. Who had the mic? What perspective was being told? Who talked for how long? The G20 piece was terrible. It was an hour of a whole bunch of people who had nothing to do with the mobilization on the street. One guy was a journalist. The other guy was a commentator about G20 stuff. You even heard I don't know if it's the chef or what his title is, the head of the G20 speaking. You heard from the police, the Toronto police, talking about how everybody should secure themselves in their houses from the violent demonstrators. You heard all of those perspectives, but you didn't hear from the demonstrators themselves. You didn't hear from the people who were concerned about rights and how that would be experienced on the street. Well, Groundwire is concerned with those issues. So we featured the voices of labor movements who were going to be out on the streets demonstrating against the G20. And we also featured the voices of the coalition that was moving a challenge in the courts against the security fence and the police tactics that were coming out in the media in the lead up to the conference. So totally different perspective. One offering you a perspective of rights. These are your rights as Canadian citizens. These are the concerns that are bringing people out to the streets, so a movement point of view. And the other, just another series of talking heads talking about something they're not invested in, which is pretty much what the news is. So that point of orientation, telling the points of view from the experience of those who are directly affected, is how Groundwire approaches integrity and accuracy. So when we tell our facts, we don't use the approach of the mainstream media. Oh, it's an issue about refugees. Well, we're going to go talk to the Minister of Refugees. We're going to go talk to some border agents. We're going to talk to, airport security, whatever it is, right? The people who police and control and create policies and regulations. No, that's not going to be our orientation. Our orientation has been and will always be the communities directly affected. So we will go and talk to either refugees or the organizations that support and work beside them. So sorry, this gets loud. Low. Our approach to integrity and accuracy is really trying to redefine how we report our facts and the point of view that we report them from. And so what we consider due diligence is when we file a story and broadcast from the point of view of the communities who are directly affected. When you tell the facts from those orientations, then you can be assured that the news that you're producing is going to be told from a different point of view, because most other media are not covering those bureaus, those communities that I had showed you before. And I think what's also important to note with regard to Groundwire is our approach to anti-oppression. We value that the media landscape has a role in underpinning and supporting injustices and oppression in our society. Media is power. Media in politics are integral, right? What happens there in the media supports things that are happening in our society all the time, and particularly when it comes to social inequality or economic inequality. There's stereotypes, there's myths, there's marginalization, there's underrepresentation. The mass media has those problems, and one of the ways in which Groundwire, as a mass form of media, tries to be conscious of that and apply that to our own work is having this view of anti-oppression, not only in terms of our production processes, but also in the content that we're producing as well. We recognize that we are working to address those issues in the media landscape through not only our collaborative production processes, but through these priority bureaus as well. So I wanted to share with you a quote from an article that we wrote for Groundwire that'll be published in 2016. It's in a chapter called Groundwire, Growing Community News Journalism in Canada. Interestingly enough, it was at a journalism policy conference. And what we were trying to do is define, and this was a good collective reflection, right? We collaboratively wrote this in the steering committee. We had feedback. I think Ome, who was in here a second ago, was one of the readers that we got to read it. We had other members of the community radio sector who had contributed to Groundwire read it and give feedback. So it was really collaborative production process even to make this article happen. And we presented it at a conference to present what kinds of policies we felt would support this environment. Because I think Groundwire has a pretty good handle on our approach to education. You know, we've even done our own research with the news data analysis. But policy is something that this paper was an opportunity to also think about what kind of policies could support these practices. So in another space, another time, I can tell you more about the policy implications of this work. But just for today's purposes, I wanted to highlight this quote, that the policies that we practice, whether it's our priority bureaus, what I just showed you in the editorial policy, what I've told you about the governance practices and the collective production practices, that for us is what is the definition of community radio news. And so when we think about how we distinguish ourselves, these are the ways in which we feel Groundwire is distinguished as a mass media. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'll open it up for your questions. I'm looking forward to the conversation. But this is basically Groundwire in community radio news in Canada, and just trying to, I'm trying to go back to the website. Trying to create a national platform for linking up all these different communities. Oh, actually, I think I have it here. So the main vision behind Groundwire, when we think about it as a national news platform and trying to be a mass media, is that these priority boroughs are linked in every community. So what's happening in Hay River on labor issues is just as relevant to workers in Montreal as it would be from coast to coast to coast. Workers face common issues across the country. Knowing how Fredericton is approaching poverty is really crucial for another city or even a rural area to think about, right? Like, oh, that tactic worked there. Maybe that would work here. Oh, they're challenging this in the courts. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe we should. So that's the kind of collaboration and linking up between movements that I think is also built into this mass media mandate of trying to be national community radio news in Canada. So please check it out, groundwire.ncra.ca. That's the website at the bottom. And if you wanted to reach Groundwire or communicate with the steering committee or the national coordinators, which work as a team, you can do so at the email that's at the bottom. Oh, yes, of course. Good link in, Victoria. And you can listen at rabble.ca. RPN. Yeah. Yeah. It's linked right at the top, like I showed you before. So if you want to ask a question, the only request is that you go to the microphone. Unless there's a brave soul who would like to run around and share the microphone, which I'm happy to do. But yeah, you'll do it? You want to ask a question? Thank you, Deepak. Please introduce yourself when you ask your question, because we have an audience, and maybe some of you don't know each other.
I'm Deepak Sahasrabudhe. I'm from New Westminster in British Columbia. And I'm here because I'm curious about what conversation people in radio would have. I'm involved in community television. And previously I've been involved in commercial network production of programs. And some of the comments, well, I'm just amazed that the discussion here is things that I really want to be thinking about or am thinking about in terms of my community television service in New Westminster. So it's the same conversation. One of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of the form and volunteers working in our programs is that technology drives form, especially in television. And when I was involved in network television production, the Betacam camera transformed what television was. And back in the early 80s, we started what is now reality television, because we could have multiple Betacam cameras out in the field making programs. And what I learned from that process is you can make them more efficient. You can make people can work with this technology, and as the technology became smarter, like the cameras we use today, have a better capacity for focusing than I do. So that's a good thing. And so maybe, well, what we're doing is making sure that our volunteers have what we can afford, the best equipment we can afford, so that the pictures are very good. Oddly enough, our problems are always with sound.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because I also work with video producers, specifically doing sound, and a lot of people will go, I don't know why, but even in school, when documentary production or filmmaking, everything is being taught, they said, we get like 2 lessons on how to do sound. So anyway, so I'm really happy that you said that, because I think sound is, it's 50% or even more than 50% in some cases. But you're, just a few reflections on technology. I think what's what's good and what is really challenging now, I remember back, like, just to give you an idea about how long I have been in community media, I remember my first broadcast quality cassette machine, which I bought when I was doing freelance work for CBC. It was a Sony TC-110 cassette machine. no, 10C is 110 or 110B. Maybe it was the B. I didn't remember what the initial was afterwards. But the thing is, it had to have an external microphone because there's always what they call built-in microphones. And one of the biggest heartbreaks of working with volunteers is they think that that's a microphone and they come in and you can't hear a darn thing that they did. But because it's called mic, M-I-C on the bottom. Anyway, that's sort of a sidebar. But the thing is, that cassette machine and Electro Voice microphone cost $1,000. So you stop to consider that to get a broadcast quality piece of equipment back in the 70s was that expensive, then people, first of all, the tools were not available and accessible to them. And then back at Co-op Radio in 1982, when I was doing programming there and teaching how to do radio programs, we were editing on reel-to-reel tape machines, quarter track, which is kind of an eccentric little thing where you could record on one side and it gets programs on tracks 1 and 3, and then you flip it over and it gets programs on 3 and 4, and somebody will then take that and put it on the wrong machine and you'll get all of them together. So, the quality was abysmal. And so those are the kinds of tools that we had. Now we take a look at the tools that are available, and it's like the recorder I use for network quality stuff is the Zoom. I love the Samsung Zoom products. Anyway, under $200, and it's fabulous. And also video cameras, people can do things with their smartphones. The only thing is, they're not always doing it. Like, what about the content that you're producing? Just because you can doesn't mean you should, in a lot of cases. And so helping people find appropriate technology, and I'm sure in community television stations, there's a lot of technology out there that isn't compatible with the kinds of equipment that you have for actually putting it out on the transmitter. So it's sort of like now we have so many choices, but not all those choices really, really work all that well in terms of creating programs because they just don't have much sophistication. Okay, so anyway, but just to wrap it up and saying that the technical choices that we make and also how we train people to put programs together. There's a podcast program that you can get that takes out all the silences between words. That's like cutting out all the rests in a Beethoven symphony. It's like just because there is technology out there does not mean it's appropriate for what we're doing or that it's useful for what we're doing. So yeah, lots and lots of technical decision making as well as how we train people to use that equipment which they have chosen and which we have helped them choose.
Can I just also add that the comments that Gretchen made about the editorial policy are things that I think editorial policy are things that we'll be looking into for
Sure.
our work too.
I think also just to address the issue of technology is that there are ways of also thinking about changing the structures, right? Like not just how we use what we're doing with the technology, what kind of programming we're producing, but also how we do the doing, right? So you can think of something like television, which is very hierarchical. You have a director, you have an executive producer. Sure, you can create different titles, Fuzzy Bear and whatever. That doesn't make it necessarily horizontal. What makes it horizontal is making sure that every individual that comes to that production process can be a director, can be an executive producer. It doesn't matter what the title is, but as long as you have a collaborative, horizontal, a chain of command that can flow, that any member can go and do what they want to do and choose to be that director and choose to be that executive producer and all of that. Those are the ways I think that really matter. It's not just about the technology or the software, it's also about what we do with it and how we do the doing. I also wanted to mention that the technology issue that Victoria brought up in terms of transitioning from very costly equipment to be able to produce podcasts or radio content or television content, that transition happened in the 90s, and it wasn't just about the technology, it was also about the softwares and the platforms too. Because it was also in the 90s that radioforall.net opened and indiemedia.org was launched and archive.org, online sites for uploading audio and video content. YouTube, sure, it came later, but that's corporate and who cares, right? Let's think about the nonprofits. They were out there doing it first, right? And then also at that time, besides these platforms, you had softwares. First, it was Cool Edit for the radio folks out there that was offering a free download on their website, and for forever you could use this as long as you just had the trial version, and it worked. It worked fabulously. But soon after, I think it was as early as 1999, Audacity was invented, which is an open source audio editor, digital audio editor. So previous to that, to edit audio like on tape that Victoria described, was analog and razor blades and like Scotch tape, which is not an accessible editing process. If you want to like turn someone off of radio, no, for sure, it's fun. But if you want to overwhelm people and like never see them again, then show them analog editing as like their intro to how to produce for you. Sure, the MP3 players came along, but you know, often the buttons were tiny and you could edit on them. But these digital editing suites that are open source were fabulous, and it actually was part of what I call the resurgence in community radio. And I'll be speaking about those that history at the 3:30 panel. Other questions, comments? And Deepak's going to pass you the mic. Don't forget to introduce yourself, Emmanuel.
My name is Manuel Sayre. I'm the program director at CHO 9.1 FM here in Ottawa at the University of Ottawa, bilingual radio station. And kind of speaking to your point, you mentioned with volunteers and feeling hesitant about requiring standards from volunteers. I would wonder what your thought is on the term volunteers. Something we've recently changed at the station is moving away from the word volunteer and moving more to contributor. Because volunteer kind of implies that you're doing something for free that you should be paid for, whereas we see it more as contributing to independent media, and part of that is that it's not a paid position. So do you think maybe a language shift could maybe empower people and maybe help raise like kind of the level of the content, and maybe it's, you know, these simple linguistic things that kind of hold people back, and I think there's a sense of pride of saying you're contributing to indie media, not, oh, I'm just a volunteer.
Yeah, very good points. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Just goes with that. So yeah, hello. I'm Barbara, coming from Vienna, Austria, where I run a community television station, and we always did a lot of training and feedback with our contributors, and when you were asking how to tell people to do their shows better, am I allowed to do that? I think yes. And from the perspective that came to me very clear when you started your show, which was really interesting, but when I listened to the voices, I felt something that I often feel when people, volunteers or contributors, non-professionals do media. You listen to them and you get the feeling that there's somebody talking to you who says, oh, I'm not quite sure if I'm really allowed to talk. And that's the point. If I say, you have to come to the point, or to be self-assured enough to say, I'm here and I'm talking, and what I have to say is interesting. And if I tell people that, I think I can do that. It's not a problem of treating them as employees or something like that. It's a problem, it's a question of empowerment, and to make them able to produce their shows, TV, radio, whatever, in a way that people like to listen to them or like to watch them.
Excellent points. And first of all, Emmanuel, is that it? Yeah. First of all, to address your point, that's excellent. I just, whenever I've been to conferences and people said, well, what do you do at the station? Oh, I'm just a volunteer. It's like, that's one thing I try to say is no, there's no just about it. Volunteer is a hangover language that hangs around in community radio, and it's being used and abused in all manners of society, because volunteers are often synonymous with labor we can't pay for. You know, I think that's really, really terrible. At Rabble, I don't really refer to our podcasters as volunteers, and also at Rabble in general, we have contributors. We have some who are paid, we have some who are unpaid, but we do use that at Rabble, which is really, really good as well. And the whole point about empowerment, I find I often say to people, it's amazing. Like a microphone is a magic wand, and it always absolutely amazed me when people would come into the station, and especially true of women. I notice they come in and they say, "Oh, I just want to shelve CDs." It's like, I don't really want to go on air. It's like, I don't know what I would go on the air about. And it's like 2 months later, they start getting interested. And their first steps are very tentative and very hesitant. I mean, there are times when all of us don't feel terribly confident about what we're saying. And that whole voice of God kind of thing from the major media, I think, is really like I don't want to talk like Peter Mansbridge, like I'm an expert on this, because damn it, he's not an expert either. And yet here he is standing up there pontificating. So I think maybe it has partly to do with that. But the other thing is, too, confidence is something which needs to be learned. And it comes from here, and it's reflected in the voice. And things like, I've done some voice coaching before where it's sort of like having confidence in your own words is where it starts. And so it's not really about the craft of doing radio as much as it is what is it that you're saying, what do you have to contribute, and let's work on that voice so that you're confident with it. And my very, very last point here is in terms of volunteers and how they're treated in community media, it's just, I'm not involved in community TV, but I do know people who are working in the Rogers Model community TV now and have been for a lot of years. And one thing that people are saying to me, which I'd like to know more about, is that some of the cable companies, what they've done in their community channel is everything is produced from the top on down, and volunteers are treated like unpaid employees. Sort of like it used to be, you could propose a show and say, I want to do the show, and have editorial control. Now I've been told that there is this trend towards just slotting people in. Okay, we want a person to do this, so you're going to do camera, but only for these features, and we want these kinds of features. And it's like treating people like they are employees but not paying them. And that's something that I'm really, really sensitive about, that I don't want any kind of community media organization that I'm involved with to be that model. And I think that it's just wrong to ask people to do what you would pay somebody to do, and and have that degree of control over their work. So it's sort of like I'm really interested in all the different models, but it's like for a person to be to have their work valued at its fullest is to say, I care about what you're saying and you have input into this process. And what Gretchen was talking about, it's great to see the ways that they've done it as well, because it's like volunteers are not just unpaid staff, they're contributors. And I really appreciate that you said that, Emmanuel, and I'm going to reshape my language, even though for Rabble I don't call them anything. I just say thanks for doing a program.
I just wanted to mention, too, in the context of having a lot of our community stations being either run by nonprofits that are volunteers, if we're looking for new kinds of language, are also members often of these stations. And so we have to remember that that's a very important category, right? In some way, they should be engaging in the governance practices, not just programming, and also in the audience engagement practice. They're members, they're invested. So if anything, it's member-produced content. And Groundwire, we also use the word contributors and producers. So the stations who host the production are the producing stations, and the contributors who syndicate their content are the contributors. And the other issue about voice, I think what you describe, I forgot your name from Vienna? Barbara. What you describe, I think, is something that Groundwire is sort of trying to problematize in two different ways. One, as I mentioned, we're trying to break through how news is presented and trying to present that in different ways. We also want to make sure that that presentation is really reflective of the people who are speaking and not applying to some standard that was externally set outside of Groundwire, some kind of news, content standard, as I had mentioned before, but also trying to transform how listeners hear the news. When I was at CKUT, for example, we started a program that was hosted by members living with disabilities. And I remember hearing comments from fellow news producers who was like, maybe they shouldn't be doing a news show. They're not reading the script. Like, you should be reading a news script. And I was like, that's great. Now we're going to listen to news from a different voice. And we have to learn how to hear that voice and how to recognize that voice as news. And I think this is a problem in our society, especially a society that has so many forms of oppression. But think of something like patriarchy. What we can go through the countries of how long it took women to even just be on air, even presenting news. But why, right? Like at that point, hearing news from a woman was not legitimate. So your concern that you're hearing voices that are not confident is linked to delegitimizing non-confident voices, right? So what is it about their voices that make them non-confident? And we have to think about that. So there's two things there, right? Like, yeah, one, we want to be representative and, challenge, newspeak and present new ways of speaking the news. But then also we have to be sensitive to the fact that some voices are valued and some are not. And we need to break through that hegemony as well. Other folks?
Hi, my name is Nicholas Pelletier. I'm from SHIZ 94.3 in Quebec City, the student radio of Laval University students. And my question is, was that? Yes, yeah, back from 1992 or so. So, yeah, my question is about accessibility, especially around mobile apps. Do shows like Groundwire or even Rabble podcast need to have to be like the accessibility that professional or big media have? Is it a must-have for you? Do you have a mobile app first? And my question is it a must-have for community radio content to be accessible on mobile apps?
That's a really, really good question. And the thing is, this is something that with Rabble, because Rabble was started in 2001, 2002, we have like a wealth of content. We have basically a history of Canada from the progressive perspective that goes back all those years. But the thing is, we also have a platform that can't easily be changed every single time something new comes along. And so right now, making our site more mobile friendly is something that's a big priority of our overworked and underpaid tech team. And the thing is, it's mobile now. It's like if you can't be picked up easily on an iPad or a mobile phone, people are not going to go to a web browser necessarily. And the thing is, it's like one thing that I find that kind of sometimes I have to remind myself to think about too is the audience perspective as well. And in talking about, doing programs in different ways, we also, how do we meet our audience halfway? And part of that is programming, part of it is technology as well. Right now, as one thing with the podcast network that's becoming increasingly obvious to me is we have to be available a lot more easily on a mobile app. And that would mean like using something like Stitcher or Overcast that people will listen on their phones, because phones are where people are going to listen to podcasts now in a different way than when they go to look at websites on the internet on mobile devices. But the thing is, the economic model of distribution of magazines like ours too is based on the number of people you get going to the website. So if we put something on Stitcher, or even, and we have iTunes links as well, and we do get those statistics, but if we put something on Stitcher, how do we then build our statistics for going out and showing our supporters and advertisers, because we do have advertisers, and demonstrating our reach and our value in terms of audience numbers? So SoundCloud, I love using SoundCloud, but the thing is, if I post something on SoundCloud, then it's not registered as a statistic on the main site. So then Facebook, if we distribute on things on Facebook and YouTube, do we then have to go and add up all of these numbers and promote on 15 different platforms? And so the technology is changing, and I think the answer is yes, we have to do that. But are there ways of integrating that into the main site? Is the main site even going to be relevant in 2 or 3 years? So there are huge, huge technological questions that it's partly economic, but it's also about reaching our communities. It's like, how do they want to receive us, and what do we have to do? So it's a very, very, very big question, and we can't be stuck. I've even had the question about radio signals, for example. One of the reasons why I moved over to the internet is because I have so much more ability to reach people through the internet than I do through an FM transmitter alone. I think there are ways of merging those two, which is another subject for tomorrow. But the thing is, technology is going to evolve as technology evolves, and we got to march along with it to a certain extent. And there are a lot of questions about how to do that, and I'm always looking for new answers. If you have any, let us know.
Yeah, I think having a common platform to easily distribute community news content would be fabulous. You can access via the cell phone both content on Rabble as well as Groundwire, but is it as easy as pressing play on an app to get the latest episode? No, you actually have to navigate pages. When you go to Groundwire's website, you have to actually exit the mobile website, because it does show up beautifully on your phone, the Groundwire website, but you don't get the actual episode through the mobile version of the website. You have to go to the regular HTML version to actually download the attached MP3 file and listen to it. So it's overly complicated. And that would be something that I would hope, if there's hackers and open source technology developers in the room, or maybe your sister-in-law is, or whatever it is, if you know people out there, please talk to somebody and get them on this, because you know, using corporate forums like YouTube don't make sense. You know, what's going to replace YouTube? The fact that when you use social media, for example, like Twitter, to tweet, that archive is not your archive, it's Twitter's archive, and then that archive is not publicly accessible. So like all the stuff that happened in Egypt on Twitter is lost from 2011. You can't even access that archive anymore. So it's not good for movements, and it's not good for community media. We need our own platforms. And so I really believe that we have to move towards a future of developing these kinds of apps, and not to address every new technological fad, but really to meet our listeners where they're at. And yeah, a lot of listeners have cell phones, not all of them. I will argue forever that the FM dial is still relevant, because even these things die. The batteries are dead. Wind-up radios exist, not wind-up cell phones yet, right? So I think that that's always valid, but I do think that we live in a multi-platform reality, and my whole media experience has been multi-platform. So it's kind of just the way I roll. We have a lunch at 12:30. It's 12:33. So I'm just going to say you're all liberated from the room. I'm going to thank Victoria and myself for showing up, and I thank you all for asking questions. I think that's really awesome. But if there's other questions, please feel free. I know that I personally have to run away in 10 minutes, but if there's other questions, please feel free.